Okay. Summary of changes for specific reports. There were some changes for child count, specifically 089 in this release. We had some membership changes. We had some changes for directory and the CCD schools file. We can talk about those because we're going to look at the release notes and we'll look at some of the specific tickets, but this just summarizes the reports that were affected in this release. Next slide, please. For the user interface, and we're going to look at this in a little more detail, but it's basically going to be this. One of the things that we had been talking about is trying to refine the migration process in a few different ways, right? Make it easier to do, that's one side of it, but then also provide more feedback, right? More ways for you to be able to interact with it, to know what's happening. And full disclosure, it wasn't very good at providing feedback. So this is we've got a few things we're planning to do. We couldn't get all of that into 11 because 11 was big for other reasons. But what we were able to get into this release is when you run a migration. So if you're familiar with Generate, and we're going to go over this in a little more detail later. But there are 3 migration screens for the 3 different levels of migration. On each of those now, we're going to display the data migration histories table, which is basically the log file that we write to during the process. So as we start a new stored procedure, for instance, right, we write an entry into the log. And then when we start the next one, we write an entry into the log. And that way you can sort of follow the progress of a migration, because in order to simplify, right, we created wrappers previously. And the wrapper is a single script that you have to execute when you go into the user interface, which makes it a lot easier, right? You select one thing, run it, and it runs all the necessary steps sort of underneath. Well, now with data migration histories on screen, you can actually see those sub-processes. You can see them starting, finishing. So hopefully that'll provide a little more transparency to the migration process, make it a little easier for you to follow. And then, in the hopefully extremely rare chance that something doesn't go well, you would actually be able to see that in the log on screen. So that's our change for the UI in this one. There wasn't much else for the UI in 11. And then general changes, this is what we're going to spend the majority of the time talking about, is this work. And we're going to go into detail on a lot of this stuff, but the summary basically is we upgraded Generate to version 11 of the data warehouse. So, and that required some changes to the structure itself, and we're going to go over those. And then we also took the opportunity, because we were going to be going in and working with the infrastructure parts of Generate, we took the opportunity to update the column names so that we could align them with, first off, the CEDS naming standard, and then also with the CEDS data warehouse, so that those names are now aligned. It should be a lot simpler. It does create a little bit of work for ETLs that you already have built, and we're going to go through that in hopefully not obnoxious detail, but we're going to go through that in a lot more detail for you. But what that does do is it simplifies things considerably going forward, because now the names are aligned between the data warehouse and staging. It's a lot easier to follow a particular element through. And then also, it, like for the open source community, right, for anyone that's working in that environment, or anyone that comes and retrieves that information or retrieves data warehouse from there, the staging environment from there, any of those things, all of that stuff is now aligned. So it should be a lot easier to use. There's some migration improvements that we made. We're going to talk about those. And then we did add one new utility as part of this release. But again, we had a lot to do with the infrastructure stuff, so we didn't get to spend as much time on the utility work for this release, but we do have one to show you in this release. Okay. So here I'm going to share my screen because we're going to just go through the entire release here. Okay. Quick thumbs up. Can everybody see, or can anybody see my screen? Okay. So these are the release notes. Now, again, like Dan mentioned, this is the first office hours we've done prior to the actual release. So the release notes are mostly final. All the data is in there, really. I think all we're going to do is just sort of make sure the formatting is cleaned up and things like that. So they might change slightly from what we're looking at today, but they're not going to change significantly. And the actual content isn't going to change because we are done with all of our work at this point. We're now in the process of doing the packaging the release, testing that package. We're going to do a soft launch in a couple of states, and we really appreciate the states that are helping us out with that. So just as we're going through this, if you see formatting looks a little off, things like that, that'll be cleaned up when we actually officially release. But for those states, if you have not looked at the release notes or have not seen these before, quick, just go through the format. Purpose is what the release notes document is for. Release overview, and I'm going to try not to scroll too fast here so it's not obnoxious while we're looking at it. So the release overview, this section, we basically just talk about a high level, what's in this release, what can you expect, all right? And we're going to go into those in more detail, so I'm not going to do that now. This section is probably the one most states are most interested in. The next section is state ETL changes, and that is anything in this release that actually impacts the ETLs that you've already built, or that you might be in the process of building, or that you are just about to start building. Like you may have done a little bit of work and you may have had some things that you looked at or examples or things like that. So these are any changes that we make that actually require a change to the state's ETL. And just to be upfront, we typically don't have a lot of this, right? Because we don't do anything that touches the staging environment, or sorry, I shouldn't say we don't ever. Obviously we do. We don't frequently do anything that touches staging, and we don't do anything that touches your code specifically. But in this case, because we were doing some infrastructure work, like some tables change, some columns and tables change, which means if you have an ETL that reference those tables, you're just going to have to update the ETL. And we're going to go over all of what those changes are in detail and show you the tools that we've developed to hopefully make that easy for you. So we'll go over that in a little bit as well. But that part, that's the reason we put the state ETL changes up near the top of the document. So, you can see that pretty quickly. You're aware of anything that you might need to do on your side in preparation for this release or any release that has something like that up there. Then the generate enhancements section is all of the actual tickets. So this one has just a quick layout. It's got the category, which is the file specification group that change applies to. If it's for a specific report or reports, it will have the number there. It has a brief description of what that change was, and then it has a ticket number on our side as a reference. And then we also have a type of impact on the outside, which kind of groups them so you can see what type of change this was. And in this case, so really quickly to understand generate, we do our major version release, so advancing to the next version at this time, like late summer, midsummer, late summer, whatever we're calling this. In South Carolina, this is the beginning of summer. But we typically release at this time. That's our major release because we have a longer window of time from the last release, which is usually prior to child count and membership and that group of files. So we have a longer window. So this is where we typically do more work. We get more if we have infrastructure work, if we have tools we're trying to build, enhancements we're trying to add. And then we typically have 3 releases during the year, and those correspond to the major submission windows, right? So we'll have a release that targets the next set of files that are due, then a release that targets the next set, and a release that targets the next set. Then we roll back into our big summer release. So really quickly, for those of you that have been with us, I apologize. The version that you currently have, if you're up to date, is 5.3. We are going to version 11. And yes, that was intentional. We do odd things as developers, but that one actually was intentional. We're trying to align ourselves with CEDS and the data warehouse, right? So Generate had its own release schedule. And we were releasing on our numbers, right? So we would do 5.1, 5.2, 5.3, and we would go to 6. CEDS and the data warehouse, those are two separate things, but they're on version 11 currently. So we wanted to align ourselves with them so that because this was an aligning release, now all of the products that all contribute to the Generate effort are all on the same version. And then so you're aware, CEDS releases a new version at the beginning of the year. So in January, I don't know specific dates, but they release at the beginning of the year. The data warehouse releases those changes shortly thereafter, and then Generate will release the changes that encompass that in summer. So we will be synced up. So CEDS will go to 12 in January. The data warehouse will go to 12 shortly after. Generate will go to 12 in August, typically. So that's the reason we're jumping from 5 dot something to 11. And if you see any references to 6, it's just because we missed it. We're actually going to version 11. Okay. So going through the tickets specifically, we can go into detail on these. Most of these are just minor changes that came up, like either bug fixes or small enhancements that we could get in. And then we put those in by file specification. And then we have user interface changes and then general changes. The general changes in this release, there's a lot because we're documenting a lot of the infrastructure changes and the things that we did. So typically, you're not going to have this many tickets in a release, even a summer release, which is bigger, but just because of all the infrastructure changes. So this one actually goes like almost 2 full pages of tickets. We don't typically have that many, but so beyond that group at the top, which are file specification specific, the rest of this is the infrastructure, the aligning of Generate to the data warehouse and to CEDS. So that's what a lot of that stuff is. And then at the bottom, it gives you the type of impact so you can see those column things. If there are any specific things that are required for the update, we would document them here in upgrade procedure, and they would also be in that ETL changes. It would probably be named slightly different. Anything you have to do prior to the release, meaning because of this release, we're updating like a supporting software package or something like that. Those would be documented at the top, but also documented here. And then compatible systems is just what we test against up to this point. Okay. We're now going to go into detail on the version 11 stuff, but does anybody have any questions about the release notes specifically, or did you see a ticket in there that you had a question on before I move on? Okay, I don't see a hand up, so I'm going to jump in. Okay, so we'll drop that. Get my notes back up here. So the first thing I wanted to go into was there are 3 kind of changes, 3 bigger changes I think that you're going to have to be aware of. We're going to cover like the state ETL changes. These are the things that impact you or us. If we're doing support for you, we might be making these changes. But if you're a state that's already like doing a lot of this work on your own, or you're a state that's picked it up wanting to try to do this work on your own, these are the things that are going to impact you, and these are the changes you'll have to make. We have a spreadsheet. I did the color coding, so if you hate it, it's my fault. We basically put together like the 5.3 table and column name, and then the corresponding, and it still says 6. I apologize because I haven't updated it. So again, the document's not complete. I'm going to go with that excuse. But it has the 5.3 table column, the 6.0 table column, so that you can see, like, this is what the staging table looked like in 5.3. This is the change in 6.0. So I highlighted column name changes in green. So that way, you know, if you are, like, if you have something that's mapping into that column, this also would apply. I want to mention this too, because a lot of the work that myself and the other ETL implementers do in states is we write a lot of debug queries, we write a lot of like validation queries, and we provide those as much as we can, so that as you're doing this work, you can check things, data as it flows through. So you might also have to update some of those, and you'll know because as soon as you run it, it will tell you that you have an invalid column name. But just so you're aware, there will be ETL updates, but you might also have some other like saved queries and things like that that you might have to update as well. And I do want to say this looks a lot more intimidating than it is. So hopefully when I go through this, you know, you'll see it's really not that bad. But anyway, so the green is a column name change between 5.3 and 11. Yellow is a brand new column in version 11 that did not exist in the 5.3 table. And then I have to scroll down a little bit because I have to find the other one. Red. Red is a column that was in 5.3 that did not carry over to the version 11 table. So those were removed. And I'm just going to go through these really quick. So this document, sorry, this will be linked from the release notes. So when you get the release notes are accessible from within Generate, by the way. So you can, there's a link, I think it's on the about, sorry, I haven't done it in a little while, but there is a link to the Generate release notes in the application. You can also get them from the website. However you get to them, there will be a link to this document so you can use it for your mapping work. But this first, we're trying to come up, this might change slightly, I don't know how much, but we've got the tabs at the bottom to try to segregate the data to make it a little more manageable, make it a little more consumable, depending on what it is you're trying to do, right? So the first tab, the one that I actually have open, is EDFacts reporting tables. So we have tables in staging that, like, because we're hoping Generate can be used beyond just EDFacts reporting, you can migrate other data in. We have fact and dimension tables that go beyond EDFacts reporting, and you can use that data to do additional state reporting, any of that kind of work. So that's the reason we have an EDFacts reporting table tab, because this only references the tables that are required for EDFacts reporting, the changes to those tables. Then we have another tab for specific. We have a specific set for the post-secondary tables if you happen to be doing any post-secondary work, or you're using Generate to try to get some post-secondary data into the data warehouse. We have a tab for the new tables that are part of version 11, and then a stripped down version of that first tab, which is just the column names that changed, right? Because the first tab shows also things that did not change, right? It shows the entire table structure with things highlighted to show the difference. The last tab shows you just things that changed. So this may change slightly again as we go through it and we try to figure out like what's the most useful way to present all of this, but you're going to have this information available to you to help you work on your ETL code, any queries you have written, so on. So this is the three types of changes that I mentioned. One of them is column name changes, right? This is not going to be all that demanding, I don't think. I'm thinking, you know, for somebody that's familiar with the ETL code, like somebody on your side that's either written it or, you know, if you're one of the states where we're working with you kind of heavily and we've written those ETLs, if you've worked with them at all, these are fairly simple changes. but the three identifiers at the top of all of the student tables changed. So the LEA identifier, the school identifier, and the student identifier, those three. So you're going to change those, and you'll notice like every one of these tables as I scroll through these has those LEA identifier. Oh, that happens to be organization. That one's slightly different. But you've got the LEA identifier, school identifier, and in this case, this one happens to be staff. I did not plan that well since I scrolled through three tables that didn't have student data in them. So those three identifiers changed, and really what changed is we stripped out the underscores because that's not the CEDS naming standard, so it doesn't have the underscores. And then these additional columns, I want to point these out for LEA. They are the relationship of that LEA to the student, right? And this again goes beyond EDFacts reporting. If you have additional data you want to load about a student, we're trying to broaden the use of the staging tables and what they can accomplish for you. So you've got like this, right? LEA identifier, SEA accountability, attendance, funding, graduation, individualized education program. I didn't think that would be that difficult to say. But there's different ways that you can represent the LEA's relationship to the student. The one we are using for EDFacts reporting, and that's the reason it's in green, is LEA identifier accountability. So that's the one that's equivalent to what you used to map to LEA identifier state. These other ones in yellow, they exist in the table. You're going to see them there, but you don't have to map anything to them unless you want to load additional data about that student. And then school identifier state goes to the new name, school identifier SEA. Student identifier state goes to student identifier state, just without the underscores. And then there's a couple of there's a couple of other changes in some of these tables, but those three are going to change in every student table. So those are quick and easy. Once you've done them in one, it's the exact same change in any of the others. That's one of the changes. There is, and we're going to go over this one in a little more detail in a second as well. So column name changes. Does anybody have any questions about that? Because the other changes we're not going to use the spreadsheet for. I'm going to show you those in a different way. Does anybody have any questions about the column name mapping, the changes, how you're going to do it, what you're going to have to do, anything? Either stunned silence or a really good description. I'm going to go with stunned silence. Okay. Get out of that. So one of the other changes that comes with this is how we identify special education students. So previously, and I have it on screen, I hope this is big enough. SSMS is not the best for presenting information, but it is where we store all of the queries and everything. So I'm going to try to leverage it here. So in Generate 5, I put .x because if you don't happen to be on 5.3, it doesn't matter. Any previous version of Generate prior to 11. The way we identified a special education student was you loaded a record into person status. Now this table is bigger than what I put on screen. I only put the columns that are required for identifying a student in special education. But you would load this data. So that bit of data there. So student identifier, LEA identifier, school identifier, the IDEA indicator, their start and end date that they were identified as special education, and then their primary disability type. And then there was also the program participation special education table, which was another way of representing a student's relationship to special education, but it had some additional data in it, right? So it had program participation begin and end date, which pretty much correspond to the IDEA status start and end date. But then it also had the educational environment for the student. And then if you happen to be doing child count, exiting, this is child count is what I was pulling up. There's also the exit reason is in program participation in special education. So you would have loaded those two tables with that data in order to identify a special education student. The change in V11 is this table, IDEA disability type. So we took, I'll do it fancy here so it doesn't look all ugly. We took those 4 columns out of person status. They no longer exist in the person status table. Those 4 columns are replaced by this table, IDEA disability type. So where you would have loaded those 4 bits of data into the person status table, you're basically going to load that same set of data into this new table. And I'll explain it in a second. And then you're still going to load a record into program participation in special education. And I'll note the one difference there in just a second. The purpose of IDEA disability type, creating a table instead of just having a couple of columns in the person status table, was this actually allows you to load all of the disability information about a student that you have. If a student is identified with 3 different disabilities, you can load all 3 of them. There are flags in the table. I only put one, is primary disability. There is another flag called is secondary disability. But you could load as many records as you needed to fully identify this student with their disabilities. And then all you have to do for EDFacts reporting is just set the flag is primary disability for the one that you want reported, which is what we used to do here, right? You used to put in the disability type that you wanted that student reported as, but that's the only disability you could load, was that single disability. With the new table structure, you can actually load all of the student's disabilities. So it expands what you can load, what you can identify about a student, and then reporting you can do out of the data warehouse about that student in other ways beyond EDFacts. But for EDFacts reporting specifically, all you have to do is load a single record with the same information, student, LEA, school, their disability type, you flag is primary disability, yes, and then the record start, record end. And I added school year in here because it doesn't exist in the person status table. If you see school year in any table, let me throw this out there, fill it in because we have code in the background that actually references that. And if it's missing, it will cause data to be lost in your migration. So just if you see school year in a table, populate it. And then for program participation, special education, it's exactly the same, except where we had IDEA indicator in the person status table, it's now in the program participation special education table. That's it. But you will have to make that change. So you'll have to take the 4 values that you were mapping here, and you'll have to map those, there. That's it. That's the big change. It's a table as opposed to 4 fields, but you're basically taking those same 4 bits of data that you were mapping to one location and mapping them into the new table. And I'm going to mention it a little bit later, but there's also a dimension table now called IDEA disability type, which will store all of this data in the data warehouse. So you'll have it for reporting for anything else you might want to use it for. Okay. So that's the second change of 3. That's probably the bigger one. The more time consuming is probably the name changes, just because you have to open each of your ETLs if you have a few already built. This one's pretty quick, but this one's a little bigger because you're going from 4 columns to a table. Any questions about this one before we move to the third one? Yeah. The last one is person race. And basically what this one is, in the previous version, we were trying to come up with a way to be able to capture multiple race records for a student. Say, for instance, a student transferred schools during the school year and they were identified as one race in school A and a separate race in school B. We needed a way for Generate to be able to capture both of those, right? So the valid race from school A, the valid race from school B. And this was the structure that we had for 5.3. which if you've done any of that work, this table was sort of out on its own because all the rest had those three common identifiers, like I mentioned, LEA, school, and student. This one didn't. So you had the student identifier, and then you had a generic organization identifier column, and then you had organization type. So the way this worked previously is you would put in, for instance, 1, 2, 3, and then you would say what type of organization that number identifies. So is that their LEA ID or is that their school ID? And that way you could load, as many records as you had for that student during the time period, depending on the reporting you're doing. You could load as many as you had for the student, even if the LEA was reporting a different race than maybe the school under that LEA. It gave us a lot of flexibility in that way to do that. But like I said, it ended up being this standalone sort of table that wasn't like any of the others. So we went back to more of the standard structure, but this table is expanded slightly in version 11. And also, the other thing, it is now called K-12 person race instead of just person race. And if you're familiar with some of the changes we made in previous versions, that's because we have post-secondary tables now. We're going to be adding early learning as we expand. So to differentiate the tables like the post-secondary race table from the early learning race table from the K-12 race table. So we added K-12 to it because we're going to have that same table in different domains or different levels. Anyway, sorry. So basically the same table. The thing that you're going to notice that's different here, other than the name, of course, is we have enrollment, entry, and exit. So what this allows you to do is tie that race record to a specific enrollment. So if they were enrolled at a school, 2 schools during the school year, you could add the race record with the enrollment that matches the enrollment for school A, add another race record with enrollment, entry, and exit that matches the enrollment for school B, and you can load all of the appropriate race records for a particular student. That's the other change that's going to be different because you are going to be mapping to new column names. And then there's these 2 additional data elements that didn't exist in the previous version of the table. So those are the big changes. And I shouldn't say big, that's it. Column name changes, which you can use the spreadsheet to help with. The IDEA disability types, the new table that replaces those 4 columns in person status, and then this kind of slight change to person race. That's the changes you're going to have to make in your staging ETLs. And that's what I'm hoping. This doesn't look as bad as it did when a spreadsheet came up with hundreds of rows in it. Does anybody have any questions about this one? Okay. Not going to go into great detail at the, oh wait, I think we have a question. I saw something pop up.
Yeah, Shauna just asked a question. Can you see it, Johnny?
Let me see.
It says, when do you expect the ETL checklist to be updated? Show the new structural changes. And then she has another one. Will we need to bring in any new data elements from our databases that we didn't need before, or is it pretty much the same data, but just organized with different tables and or column names?
So question 2 first, no new data elements. So this is basically just the same data you were bringing in that's going to map slightly differently. Maybe to a new column name in the case of like disability, maybe to that other table instead of person status. No new data, because the only time we would end up doing that is if like the actual file specification changed and it required some additional piece of data. But so no, there's no new elements you're going to have to bring in. It's just going to be remapping it to the appropriate table or location or column name. Question 1, I am the roadblock on that one. We are working on the ETL checklist right now. We've already had like our person that does that work, God bless her, has already gone through and made a lot of those changes for the V11 stuff. And she was also referencing the like the new CEDS connections to make sure we had all of that stuff in sync. And they're now on my plate to review, but we should have all of the ones, we should have a version of every checklist out when Generate releases. Updated for version 11 that will have the new column names, the new table names. So if you are a state, and I know Kentucky does, if you are a state that uses the checklists quite a bit to do your ETL work, all of them should be released by the time we release Generate. So which is, like a week or so. Maybe a little more. I don't want to commit to a week. I don't know the exact date. Did that answer your question, Shauna? Okay, cool. Okay. So at the RDS level, the one thing that, okay, so there's also some name changes there, but you don't really have to worry so much about those. The only thing that would impact is, again, like if you have queries written that directly query the RDS, there were some name changes. We're also going to have a spreadsheet with those changes that's going to look similar to the one I showed you for staging. Another change is the K-12 demographic dimension used to have all of the programs in it, right? So it had economically disadvantaged and English learner and homeless and migrant and I think military connected and might have even had a couple more. And that was just not the best way to store that data, not the best way to interact with that dimension. So we actually split those out. So now there is actually a dimension for each of those programs. So there's a dimension for economically disadvantaged and English learner and homeless. So that's a slight change. If you have queries that were joining to K-12 demographics, like if you were working on homeless, for instance, or something, and you were joining to that, there's now a dimension for homeless. So you would just, it's going to be the exact same join you had written before. You're just going to join directly to the dimension for that specific program. The last thing I wanted to point out at the RDS level, there is a fact table now for special education. I want to point this out. We are not using it for Generate yet, right? We might. We're looking at that in the, is that something we can leverage? But the special education fact table came from the work with Michigan. And like a lot of the V11 changes that are in here are complements of that work between us and Michigan. But what that does is it actually has all of the data you would need to define your special education students, everything you would need for any type of reporting, right, in one fact table. Because the fact table that we have in Generate is specifically for EDFacts reporting, right? So it has a limited amount of data. It has only the data elements that we need in order to produce the EDFacts files. This new fact table has everything you would need in it. So if you're looking at leveraging the data warehouse to do additional reporting, to do anything with your special education students, take a look at that fact table. And then populating that fact table is going to be fairly easy, and we're working on something for that as well. But just take a look at that fact table, see ways you might be able to potentially leverage it. But I do want to point out to everybody listening, we are not using it in Generate, so you don't have to worry about writing any queries against it. You don't have to worry about trying to populate it, verify it, anything like that. It is currently, it's for work outside of EDFacts reporting. Like I said, we may leverage it down the road. But currently, just be aware that it's there. Take a look at it and see if you can think of ways maybe that, loading that table up with data, and then what could you do with that? What additional reporting could come out of that table once you've loaded it up with your data? So wanted to point that out, that it was there. Last thing, we're now going to go into just some general changes that are coming in the V11 release. So does anybody have any questions specifically about the infrastructure, those changes? This will be really quick because I know I'm running short on time too. Okay. So starting in version 4.2, for those of you that have been around for a while, starting in version 4.2, we refined the migration process the data flow. The previous data flow was staging into the IDS, into the RDS, the fact and dimension tables, and then the final step into the actual report tables, the aggregated numbers, all of that. We refined that process by like removing the IDS from that flow, right? So now we can actually just take the data directly from staging and populate the fact and dimension tables. And in version 4.2, we released staging to RDS for child count. That was the first one we did. And then over the next few releases, we added discipline, exiting, and staff, right? So we were obviously focused on the special education files. With version 11, every single process that we have now uses staging to RDS. So everything has been upgraded to use the new process, and the new there's a lot less code involved in the process, so it's easier if you have to, like if you're following your students through the process, you're querying that process, it's a lot simpler. But now everything uses the new staging to RDS. So that's a big one. Another one, and I think I'm going out of order here. We created a source schema, so you're going to see this. And then in that, I think I put them, where did I put it? There, sorry, I did have it in order. I messed myself up. We had talked about this previously, and you may not remember because it was a blip in a release. We came up with a standard name for the source to staging ETL code, right? You didn't have to do anything. You didn't have to change anything. There was no work for the state. We just internally said, okay, this is the naming standard we want to use for that script. The purpose of it was, we were laying the foundation, is we're trying to refine that migration process. And for us to be able to run a migration, we need to know what that stored procedure is called. So if we create a standard name for it, then we can call that name. So I want to point this out. We are never going to modify the code that is in this stored procedure, because this is going to be your specific ETL code, state specific, whatever it is you need to do to get data into the staging environment. I have them on screen. These are going to load into your environment as part of 11. They're blank, basically. I think they just have a begin end with a like a comment. But as you start like working through some of your ETL and you've got, you know, all that downtime that we all get, you can convert any that you already have written. If you can just take that code and put it in this shell, right, in this stored procedure name, and then we can use it, leverage it when we start doing the one screen migration and refining the migration process, things like that. So just so you're aware, they're going to exist. They're all blank. And you can start to use those as you have the opportunity to fill those in. Or obviously, if you're starting a new set of files, then I would suggest building it in this. It will already exist there. Just build it inside that structure. I just want to make you aware that those are there. And that I mentioned here. The one utility we came up with for this release is it allows you to check your source system reference data mapping, which is, for those of you that may not have done this in the past, this basically maps your code set values from the state into the CEDS values. That's what this table does. So it's the conversion from state-specific mappings into the CEDS value. And so that's one of the things that as you're working through a migration, as you're working through code verification, matching, all of that stuff, that will sometimes trip you up if you don't have a value mapped. Say, for instance, you know, one disability, you don't have that one disability map. Well, when you get to the end, your numbers, your counts are going to be off because that one didn't get converted, which then means the students in that group didn't get counted, so on. What this does is by domain group, so like child count, which is 2 and 89, discipline, which is the 6 files for discipline, so on. When you run it, it will actually show you all the mappings that are specific to that set of files. So, and there's only really, this is all it would take to execute it. There's only really 2 parameters you have to work, well, 3, I guess, but child count is the report group name in the file specification, or sorry, in the stored procedure itself. It has all of the specific names. You would put in the year that you want to check in your source system reference data. And then this last one says you can show all your mappings, or you can show only the ones that are missing a mapping. So this is what it looks like, hopefully. So this shows for child count, these are all the mappings that exist currently. And this is obviously our staging environment. So the IDEA disability type, and then enrollment, this ref grade level, and so on. So these are all the mappings that child count requires. So you can verify that you've got things mapped, they're mapped the way you want, rather than having to write queries against this table. The other side of that, oh, yes, sir.
Sorry, Johnny, we've got 2 questions, and as we approach the top of the hour, I'm also going to include a link to the session evaluation, so I won't have to interrupt you again.
Sure. Let me grab the. Oh, okay. Sorry, I did not see the question. I apologize. So what you can do, if you think about it like the shell stored procedure, the question is, if you didn't see it in the chat, is depending on how your stuff is structured, if you've got multiple tables or multiple stored procedures that load your staging environment, like they're all going to be built potentially differently based on a state source and requirements. You can use the common name stored procedure just as a wrapper if you need to. So you could take your existing code that might execute 2 or 3 stored procedures, might go to multiple tables. You can just take all that, put it inside the wrapper. And that way, when you run the migration, you still call the wrapper, and it would still run all of those individual things that you ran before. You don't really have to change anything you're doing. We're just going to try to encompass it all in that name. That way we know, oh, when we want to, basically we want to refine it, make it easier for you. So when you push the migration button, it can run your source to staging as well. And if we know the name, then we can execute that automatically from generate. Okay, so last thing here really quick. If you just want to see unmapped values, we don't have any because obviously it's our test data and we make our test data pretty good. So I'm going to force a couple of things to be null that should be mapped. And then if you ran the unmapped, you would see just the things that there is an existing CEDS value that has no incoming value mapped to it. So that would help you refine your source system reference data mapping. I think that was it. Oh, really quickly, I want to revisit this because I think I've said it in every single office hours. Staging validations. Leverage those. We're building those out with every release. We're adding more to it, but leverage those because they will help you identify anything that's mismapped that might cause a problem downstream, anything like that. It helps you identify it right at the very beginning as you've loaded your staging tables. And those have been updated for version 11 as well. So they have the new column names in the queries and things like that, but leverage staging validations. The other thing is for New Hampshire. They had a requirement because the way they have their web server set up to be able to run generate from a subfolder, right? So generate can't exist at the root. We were able to work that into this release as well. So for any other state that may have may want to set up generate that way, that is now going to be a possibility with version 11. There's going to be some documentation that comes out specifically the things that are going to have to change, and we're working on some automated things like that. But just so you're aware, I wanted to make sure you were aware that that feature is available, and that came from a requirement New Hampshire needed. So that's going to be available in version 11 as well. Sorry, I ended up going really long, but does anybody have any questions about that stuff I flew through right there at the end? Or any other questions that have come up during?
Johnny, Sonali asked a question that has been up in the chat now about whether this version contains any changes needed for exiting, discipline, or assessment.
Oh, okay. So we're gonna because I ended up wasting way too much time here to go through the rest of the slides. We're going to talk about 11.1, like the next release, that's specific to assessments. But the only changes for discipline and exiting, because there were no significant changes to those file specifications. So they've been updated for version 11. We ran all of our internal tests to make sure that they migrate, the tests match. So we did all of the work to try to make sure that those are functional. So yes, you should be able to use exiting discipline right out of the box with version 11. Like as soon as you upgrade to version 11, you should be able to start doing that work. Assessments, there were some requirements we needed to be able to make the assessments changes that we did not get in time. We didn't feel comfortable that we could get that work done and at the quality level that it needed to be done. So it's going to be in 11.1. And I'm sorry, I'm muting because my dog is going crazy. So that was all I had. If we want to go back and try to, and I apologize because I left no time to go back to the rest of the agenda.
So Johnny, you have a few minutes to hang out, in case anyone has other questions.
Oh, absolutely. I can definitely stay on longer, but for other people, like, want to be respectful of your time, and I went over. So, but yes, I can stay as long as anyone wants questions answered or more details, anything.
Yes, thank you, Johnny. We appreciate your expertise. It is the top of the hour, so we thank people for attending. The link to the office hours, I'll provide the office hours evaluation survey I'm providing again. Please do complete that short 2-minute survey. It really helps us make changes to improve the service tailored to your needs. I think we've covered virtually everything, but if you do have questions, as Johnny mentioned, about any of the content that was shared previously, he's offered to stick around. If you're signing off, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, everyone.